Good afternoon, and I guess it's nighttime for some people that are listening to us globally. My name's Koverola, and I am a clinical psychologist and have been in higher ed for almost 37 years, 2 more weeks, and then I will no longer be in that field. And so my topic is mobbing and moral injury, and when they co-occur, what is the path forward? So I am going to tell you just a tiny bit about my background and why I'm interested in mobbing and moral injury, and then present a model that I developed a number of years ago, conceptualizing how adverse events impact us. And then hopefully I'll have time to talk about a case study, and then just cap off with the path forward. So in terms of my background, I was trained as a clinical psychologist and really began my work in the field of trauma, specifically in child abuse, sexual abuse, and domestic violence and community violence. I then moved into being an educator and was a faculty for many years and a researcher, and the last 15 years have been serving as executive administration in universities, including dean, provost, and university president. So I bring a lot of perspective on what happens in higher ed, and have also had positions in medical schools, and so have been working very closely both with healthcare professionals as well as with the legal community. And the other thing that brings my perspective is I have worked globally and interculturally, so I bring a real global intercultural lens and really celebrate that this conference is interdisciplinary. It's about caring for people who lead and serve, which is what I'm really all about, and that we have colleagues from around the world that are engaged in what is a very human situation where people are suffering, and how can we lift people from that. And so, like I think most people that are here, mobbing has been either a personal experience, which it has been for me, or it's been somebody that you really care about has been impacted, and you've been in the work of extending support and help to people who are in that. And so I bring, from my own personal experience, from supporting friends, family members, colleagues, as well as clients. As a clinical psychologist and as a coach, I work with many people who have experienced mobbing, as well as moral injury. So, let's see. So, mobbing in the workplace, I'm not going to spend time on that because everyone who's here knows what is involved in mobbing. So that slide is going to be click. What I want to talk about is how mobbing and moral injury can co-occur. And I appreciated that already 2 presenters have used the word moral injury. Our colleague in Australia mentioned moral injury, as did Lindsay. And moral injury has been described as a piercing of the soul. It was first described about 30 years ago by Jonathan Shea, a psychiatrist who was working with vets who he was treating for post-traumatic stress disorder, which is one of the big impacts of trauma. And these veterans were not responsive to traditional PTSD treatment. And so that began a 30-year-plus legacy now of research on what is called moral injury. It's now been documented, as mobbing has, in healthcare, in the legal community, in academic, even in corporate, as well as in humanitarian sectors. Moral injury has had a few different definitions, but it's essentially 3 main components. It's either when you personally engage in acts or behaviors that violate your own moral compass. So if you think of a sniper in wartime engaging in behavior that results in the death of a civilian, that's one of the real classic examples. Acts of omission, failing to prevent actions that violate your own moral beliefs or values. you think about physicians, for example, during COVID, having to choose who do you give the ventilator to, knowing that somebody is going to die. There are many, many times when people who are in positions of working to support people who engage, who are unable to prevent insurance claim denials, for example, and physicians know this person needs this. Educators not being able to provide what is needed, and they know what's needed, and they know this will make a difference, and they can't do it, and they stand by, and it's a violation. And the betrayal, which Lindsay talked about, when institutions betray us. And when we look at, in higher education, the betrayals of institutions. In healthcare, the humanitarian sector, I have recently been in conversation with many USAID employees, former employees, foreign service workers. You think about ICE, and many of us have one particular view about ICE. And there are also ICE employees who are supporting families of 5 and 6 being asked to do things that violate their moral compass. So it's so easy to judge. And I really appreciated, I think it was Ken, you talked earlier about not issuing moral judgment, that this is about looking at the facts and looking at things holistically. And I think that when we think about mobbing and moral injury, we really need to bring compassion and empathy and look at the totality and the complexity of what's happening. So moral injury is beyond PTSD. It's beyond depression and anxiety. It is something existential. And how it manifests, there are psychological impacts, emotional changes such as depression, anger, shame, tremendous guilt. There's often behavioral manifestations of a withdrawal, not being able to contain what has happened, social isolation, and you can see the overlap between people who have experienced mobbing in the workplace, how it can then manifest in moral injury. What differentiates it, and not everyone who experiences mobbing experiences moral injury. There is a continuum of moral distress that leads to ultimately moral injury. Moral injury is really an existential or a spiritual, if you are a person of faith, where there's an anguish and despair, a belief that goodness has been shaken to the core, and there's a loss of meaning. And when people are in the throes of moral injury, they can't see beyond it. In one of the greetings, there was the talk of the reference to a person who experienced mobbing and committed suicide. So people who are in the clutches of moral injury, suicide often feels like the only option because there's no path, they do not experience a path to alleviate the tremendous anguish. It is such a deep anguish. And again, my experience, particularly as a psychologist and as a clinician, working to support people who are on a path where they've experienced tremendous suffering. Not all mobbing results in moral injury, but I have seen many, many cases where mobbing has had the impact of moral distress that has compounded such that there is a moral injury that happens. And why is it important to differentiate between these? And now I'm speaking as a clinician. It's so important because you want the right intervention. And the interventions paths are different. Some interventions can actually intensify the harm. And so mobbing is one set of experiences that can result in co-occurring moral injury. There's also burnout. Burnout is much more has to do with the exhaustion, when the demands of the workplace exceed your physical capacity. You know, you think about now with AI, for example, I think that's an excellent example of how that can lead to cognitive overload. And people are exhausted. That doesn't necessarily mean you're going to develop PTSD. You might develop some anxiety and some depression and sadness, but that's different than the experience of moral injury. And the treatment and the intervention for burnout would be very different than for post-traumatic stress disorder. You know, post-traumatic stress disorder is a common experience of somebody who's experienced victimization or a natural disaster or a car accident. You can develop PTSD from mobbing. And one of the things that happens in PTSD is that there is a fear of safety, a physical fear. So there's a physiological component to PTSD which accounts for intrusive memories or the blocking. And so with PTSD, we think of the startle response, the hypervigilance. That's a very different experience than somebody who has their traumatic or adverse life experience has resulted in a moral injury where there's been an existential anguish and depression. And so sometimes people can have both PTSD as well as moral injury. And I think it's really critical that whoever is providing support to a person who's suffering, that they understand the complexities so that they don't inadvertently do harm. Treatment for PTSD often has to do with cognitive restructuring or exposure treatment, whereas if you're experiencing moral injury, you don't need to be cognitively restructured. It's not helpful. It would be harmful to try and convince somebody, actually, that was okay. It wasn't so bad. Whereas that, and so there's very, very different kinds of clinical pathways. Vicarious trauma is another related thing to post-traumatic stress disorder, and that often happens for people who are, for example, child protective workers, emergency room physicians, nurses, emergency responders, people in the field, where they're exposed and witness the trauma, and they vicariously are traumatized. And so then they begin to develop some of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder and anxiety and depression. And then the last one that I would point that's a related concept is professional grief. You know, and most of us are familiar with, you know, the stages of grief, you know, Kubler-Ross, like, you know, is it 5 stages or 7 stages? Depends on how you think about grief. But grief is a process, and how a person is dealing with their grief, if it's a mobbing situation where the person has lost their career identity and their relationships and their jobs and all that, that is one process of healing that needs to happen. And if it's compounded with moral injury, or if it's compounded by post-traumatic stress disorder or a depressive disorder or anxiety, it's so important to understand what you're dealing with. And another thing that I had a lovely conversation with, what's your name? Jocelyn. And we over during the break about how these aren't just, you know, disorder is sort of making it seem like there's something wrong with a person, that it's a weakness. And actually, if you have been victimized or targeted or suffered moral injury, there's nothing defective about you. If you experienced moral injury, you had a moral compass, and that was violated. And so one of my personal concerns that's shared with many other clinicians is there is a tendency for us in our society to pathologize. And so I want to put that out as a caution, and something that I really feel very strongly about, that we need to respect that when these kinds of experiences happen to people, they deserve respect and dignity and an environment that is going to support and provide the pathway to healing. How am I doing on time?
You're wonderful.
Okay.
At 5 minutes and 16 seconds left.
Okay. All right. I have so many. Okay, all right. Okay, so where am I at? So I'm going to really quickly go through this quick model. It's a model that I developed actually when I was an assistant professor at the University of Manitoba in the late 80s, early 90s, so I date myself a little. But it was a model that I developed with my graduate students when we were working on how to understand sexual abuse impact on children and adults. And so very quickly, I think of individuals as composed of many component parts. We have how we think, how we feel, our physical bodies, our relationships, our gender identification, and our values. All of us have these different component parts. And how you think and how you feel, how do you make sense of things, all of those comprise of how we function. And when you experience mobbing, you have an assault on how you're thinking because you're being gaslit. There's messaging about you. It impacts your feelings. It can impact your body. It certainly impacts your relationships. What gender you are and what positionality you hold in society is impacted. When you get into the area of moral injury, when you experience betrayal by people that you respected or an institution to which you were devoted, that's where moral injury comes in. And that's how I would differentiate. And so from regular trauma, little t trauma or big T trauma, it often impacts those other areas. We also are embedded within a family and community and society. And how we think and how we feel in our bodies, our gender, that's impacted by who we are within our family context. And our family context impacts all of who we are and how we process emotions. The community circle has to do with our workplace. And so you can see these double-headed arrows. And when mobbing happens, it's that community piece impacting you in all of these different areas. So your workplace can be impacting how you think, how you feel. It can be impacting your body, your relationships with people. And society is another important factor. Right now, I really believe we live in morally injurious times. And I think to some degree, we're all experiencing moral distress. 2 minutes. We're all experiencing moral distress. And I think most people with a moral compass are wondering about their own complicity. What can I do? Am I a silent bystander? And we all have our own personal reasons for getting engaged or not getting engaged. And that is informed by our work community, our neighborhood communities, our faith communities, by our family. Who in your family do you need to protect? Who are you responsible for? And all of these things are simultaneously impinging. And mobbing and or moral injury impacts all of this. And so it's complex. The point of my model is it's really complex, and it's all happening in time. And this is, I'm not going to be able to do the case study. Okay. If you want to hear about a case study, I'll talk to you about it later. I had a great case study of somebody who exhibits both moral injury and mobbing. So the path forward. Because I do believe there's a path forward. I profoundly believe in human capacity to heal. And I see 3 really important pieces. First, understanding what happened. Is it mobbing? Is it moral injury? Is it both? Or is it one of these other related things? The healing and renewal, there are many intervention options, ranging from individual psychotherapy, using, I stress this, an appropriate treatment model. There are many treatment models that are not appropriate. Group psychotherapy, again, it must be appropriate. Faith-based options are also, for some people, the appropriate direction. There's adjunctive support such as mindfulness, meditation, nature, music, and exercise. And then finally, what we're doing here at this conference, systemic change. Engaging with one another, engaging in a community where science and research and activism and support is critical, and bringing people in who've experienced mobbing and or moral injury, and providing them a community of support. So, that's what I was. And that's my contact information in case I could be of support.